over 60 people registered, so I'm expecting quite a few more to join us. And normally we find that just past 6 o'clock, the people start pouring in. We're also broadcasting on Facebook, so if you don't wish to appear with your own name, if you don't want to be associated, this is your opportunity to change the name on your feed to something safer. If you would like to make it easier for people to tweet you or include you in tweets, you can rename yourself to include your Twitter feed as I Am Just Doing. Annie asks me to remind you, who's in charge of our social feed, our social media feed, when we get to use the chat, and I'll talk about that in a minute, if you would please include your Twitter handle, and also if you are tweeting us, tag us in as well, then that helps us to spread the word about what we're doing and what we're talking about. So we'll just give people 1 more minute, which may be enough for England to wrap up the West Indies, and we will be then starting very shortly. I hope everybody's having a good day today. See lots of faces and names that I know. Jay, it's good to see you joining us. And Leslie, nice to see you, and I hope you're well. If you're on the phone, if you're just joining it on the phone, us on the phone, but want to take part in the conversation or to email questions, then you can do so by sending a text to me. My text number is 07469 159 134. That's for those people who are joining by phone only. And I'll repeat it again, 07469 159 134. We haven't got a hashtag for this event, but do tag at radix _UK into anything that you tweet. So I think with that, we are now at 2 minutes past, which will give latecomers a chance to join us. And I am going to formally start our recording and welcome everybody to our call. Please do, as I've said before, make certain that you are muted and your video isn't running during the first half of the conversation. For those that have been around for the other constitutional reform events that we've run, then apologies that this is a repeat, but this is the 4th in our session. And what we have been trying to do in these previous sessions with Alan Rushbridger, with Simon Jenkins, and with Lord Alldritt is to look at issues which have constitutional bearings, but which are the sort of issues that either the government is going to want to tackle or need to tackle, rather than the forever liberal small and big L agendas of written constitutions and electoral reform. And the last of our series, we're going to be looking at relocalizing economics, which seems to us to have serious constitutional bearings and is, particularly in the context of COVID, going to be very, very important to us. I'm going to hand over to Nick to chair, but formally to remind you that we will be recording throughout. If we will spend half the time with a discussion between Charlotte and Nick. If you want, however, to ask questions, make comments at any stage, you can add them to the chat. I'll then be monitoring them, and we'll bring in comments into the conversation as we can, and I'll flag them for you. Or if you were just simply wanting to speak and ask a question yourself, indicate there, and once we've got through the first part of the conversation, you will be brought in to speak there. So please do use the chat to indicate you want to speak. With those comments, I'm going to introduce Nick Tyrone, who's very kindly agreed to chair for us tonight. Nick is a very eminent holder of a former post as Chief Executive. So can I please ask you to mute yourselves? there's somebody feeding back. Nick is the eminent former chief executive of Radix, which is obviously the most important thing he's ever done. But he is also a regular columnist for the Spectator and writes also regularly for the New Statesman, Conservative Home, Huff Post, Lib Dem Voice, and various other places. He's also recently been doing some research around the organisation of local administrations in the UK, which is where I thought he would be particularly appropriate to this. And he tells me he published his latest novel, Politics is Murder, in April, which wasn't necessarily the best timing, but not of his fault. I haven't read that yet, but I read his previous novel, Popstar Jihadi, which I definitely recommend to anybody with an interest in the way that news works in this country. So with that introduction, Nick, Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. So I shall start by introducing Charlotte. Charlotte Alldritt is the director of the Centre for Progressive Policy, a UK think tank that promotes inclusive growth, working with in partnership with local authorities and central government. Before setting up CPP, Charlotte was director of the RSA's Inclusive Growth Commission, and prior to that led the City Growth Commission, chaired by Lord Jim O'Neill. During the coalition, she was a senior policy advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, and with a particular focus on immigration, housing and planning, energy and the environment. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you.
Right, so we'll get right into it. Just for the viewing audience, I am going to take a slightly more local skeptic approach, just to make this slightly interesting, than I actually, in truth, hold. So getting right to it, my first question is a sort of why now question. So we've just obviously had huge COVID crisis. We're about to have proper Brexit, possibly no deal Brexit. Government will want to have more control, more power than ever before. So you'll have lots of people saying, why now? Why is now the time to think about devolving power more locally?
So I think central government will follow its centralising tendencies. That's the first thing to say, politically speaking. And I think politically speaking, the levelling up agenda is very skewed by the kind of blue war, former red war area. And we can probably come back to that in a minute. But I think the first thing I want to say about local economics is that it's a myth that we can conceive of our national economy. One of the first things that took me by surprise when I was first studying economics as an A-level student, I was so excited to think about, how the housing market really worked and what these interest rates all about and how do exchange rate fluctuations work and what impact does that have on real people's lives. And then I learned, when it got to kind of macro lesson 101, is that we have to think about how you measure stuff. And I thought, gosh, how boring. So you go through this national accounting system where you kind of figure out what's in and out of scope of gross national product or GDP or these other kind of things. And you just think, well, how is that real? How is that part of, how is that linked to what we think about when we talk about economic policy? And I think over the decades, that kind of beyond GDP movement has grown considerably. But also this sense that we can even conceive of our economy as this national thing. In fact, I think it's highly abstract and it does amount to almost a mere accounting exercise.
Okay, so if you're saying the national perceiving of the national economy is not really a thing, as a fictional kind of idea, then I suppose what's the better way of thinking about it? How local do you think we need to go?
Yeah, we have to think about how people and places work, because that's where stuff happens. That's where people work. That's where people buy things. Probably touch on the internet and e-commerce and other things throughout the course of this discussion. But ultimately, we need to think in terms of what the techie jargon is sort of happy to speak about, which is functional economic geography. Mm-hmm. That's typically conceived as travel to work areas, which at the moment is also another abstract concept, but one that I think will fast come back even if our commuting patterns change slightly, we still will live and work in places. And I think that's really important to remember. And it's absolutely essential for policymakers to have an understanding of at every level.
So it just touching on the commuting point, I mean, how much, I suppose the question is really how much that changes post-COVID, and sort of agglomeration economics, you know, this idea of like, well, we all have to be in one place at one time, and building everything around that. How much do you think that's going to change? And also, how much do you think that's going to play into the devolution agenda?
Yeah, I think the death of the city is much exaggerated. I think the death of place is similarly exaggerated. I don't think we're all going to be kind of little individual worker bees sitting at home. That's not to say that those patterns and behaviours wouldn't change, but I think it's very human to want to come together and work on a common task and meet in a social way. And I think the creative aspect, as much as the kind of fact that not everyone can work from home, and we've seen this during COVID, you know, a real kind of 50-50 split, sort of middle class, white collar professional jobs, okay, other jobs not so much. And I think that's something to think about when we're talking about inclusive recovery as well, and how we consciously build our economic recovery.
Yeah, because I guess that's another way I could skeptically put this, where if you look at the Tory government basically being able to say, well, look, we need to hold the reins of power in order to carry out this leveling up, because if we just put this back to councils, will have postcode lottery and it will be a mess and all that sort of stuff. I mean, what's the sort of what's the riposte to that?
Well, I think in a nutshell is that, you know, we've tried to tackle regional inequality for decades, probably since we first started to see, you know, the numbers go off the charts in deindustrialization during the 80s. And the then government did little to kind of intervene and stop the fallout of that. So, but we've shown that national policies are too blunt an instrument. And I think that goes back to my initial point. It's like, you know, you've gone to see the GP and actually you need kind of a limb removed or something very specific, but the GP, you know, is largely clueless or definitely wants to refer you to a specialist to deal with that particular issue in situ. I'm not sure necessarily whether the analogy holds weight. I think I'll work on that one, but I think it's just important to think about, like, places operate as systems, and it's all very well trying to coordinate a network of those systems. Need those kind of whole system holistic responses that in this case can think about, particularly post-COVID, how we integrate and conceive of and invest in economic and social policy so that it really works for those places, rather than try to direct things from Whitehall in a kind of hit it and hope strategy, and, you know, chuck money and build a road and expect wealth to trickle down, as previous kind of economic orthodoxies have purported. And we know it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely take your point about, you know, this regional inequality, and we've tried to tackle it from the center and it hasn't really worked. I guess one point that made me think was about, so take direct foreign investment. You're obviously going to have direct foreign investment is going to go into certain places much more. You know, it's going to go into places that are to some, not necessarily, but more likely to go into places which have some economic draw already. So just the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. We have the same regional inequality problem. So again, what could be said is, well, you're going to always have this problem. So the only way to do that is to, you know, central government, central taxation, etc., and then we level out. And I take your point about how it hasn't really worked, but they can say, well, you know, how are you going to get around the direct foreign investment into, you know, into poorer areas issue, if you like. So I suppose, what would be your arguments there?
Well, first of all, localism doesn't preclude central support or national policy making. We need an integrated system of governance as much on the kind of political side as on the kind of economic development side. And of course, those things should go hand in hand. So I firmly believe there's a role for the centre in, both in redistribution and in policy intervention. It's just hitting a much finer tuned balance between the two. And we might get into kind of fiscal devolution in the course of this conversation, but it's not, devolution shouldn't be, right, off you go, you're on your own.
Yeah, no, I get you. I mean, in terms of what you view, there's one way of looking at devolution. I mean, one way of looking at devolution is layers. Obviously, do we need regional parliaments? You've got that whole thing. But putting that aside for a moment, there's another way of looking at it, which is about competencies, so policy areas, and trying to devolve on a competency basis. Do you think that's a good idea? And if so, what sort of policy areas would you like to? Do you think would be the first? What would you devolve first, basically? If you do it that way.
Well, to add one part to the previous question that I didn't get to, in the kind of chicken and egg of FDI, how is it that you attract investment, particularly outside of London? You've got, for me, there's no chicken and egg situation. It's obvious. It's skills. You've got to invest in skills. Otherwise, you will have agglomerations of low-skilled, low-paid, low-value-added firms exploiting a business model that can and does continue to keep particular places in low productivity.
Right.
And we see that all across the country. So with skills has to be the key to break that cycle. And it has to be first on the list for thinking about where we go next in the devolution of powers to mayoral combined authorities. I think obviously the mayoral combined authorities are in an relative early stage of their life cycle. Some places being notably in Greater Manchester and Greater London Authority have been doing it for a lot longer. So with time comes increasing maturity and competence, to your point of view. It also comes sort of difference in appetite. So, for example, Andy Street in the West Midlands has said they're not looking at getting devolved health and social care powers like they have in Greater Manchester, even though to look at the small print, it doesn't actually amount to devolved health and social care, but we won't necessarily go down that track for now.
Right.
But, I think there's different appetites, and I think that's okay. I think the devolutionaries have become, and places themselves have become quite comfortable with this kind of variable speed idea. But I think that with COVID, the need to really respond to an unprecedented attack on their local economy. I think we might see more places demanding more support from central government in building their capacity to be able to respond locally. Because if we take, for example, what I saw from the Chancellor in his last fiscal stimulus speech, was a real absence around what to do around unemployment. It's going to fall arguably to local places to pick up. But, so you're asking an awful lot of them at a time where central government hasn't shown that it's got an answer, and after a decade of austerity and a hollowing out of their resource, given that local government was hit hardest. So the devolution white paper, or the local recovery white paper that we're expecting to see in the autumn, has to address this issue. So it's addressing a capacity issue. It's also on the skills side, not getting tied up in some of the detail and the legislative nooks and crannies and rabbit warrens that they tend to fall down. It's about thinking in principle, how can places understand what their local labour market needs are, which often is actually about data. And we've seen the timeliness and accuracy of data and lack thereof going down to local government as being a key barrier to their ability to respond to the COVID crisis on the health side. So on the economic side, we absolutely have to get that right with urgency, and linking education, skills data in FE labour market intelligence has got to be, priority number one if I were Gavin Williamson.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So that kind of brings me to devolved tax raising powers, because some of what you were saying, about obviously the austerity and the hollowing out of funding, and could we make it so that local authorities had more ability to raise their own taxes? How do you feel about that? And if you think it's something we should do, how would you, in the most obviously broadest terms, because it's quite a complex thing, broadest terms, how would you go about it?
I think, first of all, I think it's interesting with the stamp duty freeze and lifting of the threshold.
Yeah.
I think that could potentially pave the way for the abolition of stamp duty, which automatically takes out, particularly for London, one of the biggest sources of fiscal retention that they've been asking for. So I think if we get rid of stamp duty or it's significantly reformed, actually, I think a lot of people calling for fiscal devolution need to go back to the drawing board on what that necessarily needs to mean, because I think some of the arguments about how you allocate central funding pots, such as VAT and other centrally gathered revenue streams, probably will start to look a little bit more attractive. Having said that, the move to 100% business rate retention will, given that it's likely that we're going to see relatively little growth in the short term, actually could perversely then give us more insight on where places are able to grow, what initiatives and interventions have supported that, and therefore where places might learn in terms of how they build their revenue base if we were to move to more fiscally devolved model. But certainly, I think we need to be more creative in the types of financial instruments that we allow councils to utilise. So part of that will be about central government support. Part of that might be things like a hotel tax. And we've seen various cities sort of duck out of being the first mover on that for obvious reasons.
Yep.
But I think it's something that we might want to move to once the industry is out of this particular downturn. But then also the ability to leverage in private finance, philanthropic finance, and bring together the totality of resource in a place to think about how then you invest and coordinate that. And, at its most extreme, what I would be calling for is a real Devo deal that puts kind of your money where your mouth is. So we've seen these kind of piecemeal Devo deals over the last 10 years or so since the city deals in 2010. And for me, the ultimate expression of that is to say, here, Greater Manchester, here's all the money we put into the public sector. Here's all the money we would have spent on economic development and infrastructure. You go and sort it. You go and set and agree with us a whole bunch of social and economic policy goals. And then you figure out how best to spend that money. And I think a place-based spending review based on those kinds of principles could be hugely transformative and start to see us really thinking about local regeneration, local economics, local policy making, and devolve power in a whole different guise.
Right. So a question on regional banking, just your feeling on it. Some people sort of feel like it's the silver bullet, as it were. Maybe you have a similar view, maybe you have a very, very different view. I'd be interested to know your sort of thoughts on regional banking generally, but also just in sort of tying it in with local devolution. Yeah,
so I think, I'm not against regional banking at where it seems to work. And, several people that, I know are working in this space to set up, whether that's challenger banks or other sorts of mutuals. And I think there's a real place for that in addressing and diversifying access to capital, particularly for SMEs, and particularly where you can tie those returns to place-based outcomes because that investment's staying local. So I would point to the likes of, say, the Bristol and Bath Regional Capital Fund, which I think it is an inspired idea that's led to other things such as the Bristol City Fund, which is saying, how do we kind of set up not a regional bank per se, but like a regional investment fund that people could put kind of retail deposits in, and that money is going to generate a return through benefiting the place. So I think win-win in that regard. I do have some worries about kind of the risk pooling and the depth of capital at regional level. I know advocates of this approach would point to other countries and say, well, we can do it there. So, you know, Germany being an example, why couldn't we do it here? It's just my kind of primary concern. And as I said, I think it should be just one of the kind of financial instrument tools up our sleeves to enable places to have access to and greater freedoms around how they invest.
Great. I'm starting to get some questions through. There's a particularly good one from Sheila. Thank you very much for this question. And it's about how devolution will help Wigan and other towns in the shadow of Manchester. And we can broaden that out. I mean, basically, it's the towns question, isn't it? So, you know, you've got devolution to cities, you've got the Manchester deal. And you can say, well, maybe that's wonderful for Manchester, but what about Wigan? What about, you know, Blackburn? What about Preston, etc.?
Same comment from Gordon about Burnley.
Oh, same comment. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, I mean, it can be. It's basically, yeah. Where do towns fit into all this? It's the Lisa Nandy question.
Lisa Nandy question. Well, a couple of ideas. First of all, the current government's town deal, they're taking approximately 100 places and chucking in a few million quid.
Yeah.
All very nice. Totally welcome that, but it's the same scattergun approach. It's the same central government mark your homework once you, local government, have come up with a little nice idea that you're going to pitch to someone in the Cabinet Office or BEIS or MHCLG, and they agree, you know, your new footpath scheme or whatever seemingly parochial idea that may or may not have passed kind of central government muster. So I am concerned that government thinks it's done towns by setting up that fund.
Yeah.
I therefore would turn back to the city regions and make it a duty of elected mayors of mayoral combined authorities that they have as much of a responsibility for within regional equality. Levelling Up seeks to address between regional inequality. So it should be Andy Burnham's concern that the people across Greater Manchester, whether that's Oldham or elsewhere, have access to opportunities, and that growth and the recovery is as inclusive, which I think really should signal a new approach to how we think about local economic development and regeneration. It means that it's not just about, you know, building new tram lines in from Trafford to central Manchester. It's not just about kind of building satellite offices for national firms in provincial cities, and that those shiny new buildings being a source of business rate revenue generation and jobs. It's got to be a more fundamental bottom-up approach that builds on the assets of places but doesn't replicate the same mistakes we see of central government, which is, well, I've outlined them earlier, but I would put the duty heavily on city regional mayors to be responsible for their whole city regions. And I think you need to go down to that level because we have such variation in our economic geographies of cities. So the dynamics of the West Midlands is very different to the dynamics of Greater Manchester, which is in turn entirely different from a fragmented, disaggregated economy of the type you see in Cornwall, for example.
Yeah.
So make it place-based, make it strategic, make it part of that approach to how you build up a whole region where the city and its relationships with its towns will be much more nuanced. Don't just think, well, if you're a Wigan or an Oldham, how do I get some of this, and can you spread the jam over here, please? It's got to be much more about how places work together and are part of a whole place ecosystem.
Yes. So you made me think about structure of local government, because I sort of undertook a project on this, which was extremely, complicated, to say the least. And it's a wide-ranging question, which you can kind of take as you will, but it's really about, do we have the right structure of government? Because obviously, I was thinking about when you were talking about regional banks in Germany, etc., and you're right about, I mean, the risk problem is a problem regardless, but I was just thinking about, obviously Germany has such a different structure in terms of how it's laid out. And there are historical reasons for that, which we don't need to get into, but it just is what it is. And whereas we've kind of evolved the system that we've got, and a lot of that has been around having a very centralized model. So do we need to change the structure of local government? And if so, how much? I mean, there's been loads of ideas over the years. I mean, obviously you had regional parliaments, that kind of stuff. I mean, what would you, if you could do anything in terms of the structure of local government, what would you do?
There's a question in the kind of devolution politics about whether we need to neaten the map. So do we need, for example, combined authorities everywhere with the same powers everywhere, and that should apply equally to cities as to counties or some other configuration? I think the more important question is how we neaten the map when it comes to public sector boundaries across a place, however we define that place. Because you cannot do what's so essential for inclusive recovery and inclusive growth around the integration between social and economic policy, i.e. how investment and policy and delivery of public services supports people and firms and economic activity to grow and flourish. Those two things go hand in hand, but they will so often compete when you just get stuck by not only organizational and institutional and cultural boundaries, but physical boundaries of who's in what, CCE or combined authority, or let's go back to the West Midlands where they've got, observer LEPs and non-constituent members in the combined authority, and some LAs are out and some are in, and the mayor, doesn't even have a veto decision-making power across all of that. He needs a double mandate so that everybody agrees, so that nothing gets done. We need to, if this is going to be a success, we need to cut through that. And I would say it would be more transformational for places to be given a devolution deal, for argument's sake, that we go back to that kind of process, which is predicated on the neatening of their public sector boundaries, than to have an elected mayor. I think that is, who cares if you call it a leader of the council or an elected mayor? I couldn't get upset or excited about that.
Right.
Although I think in theory, if we had a combined mayor or combined authorities, then wouldn't that be simpler? But if you don't want a mayor, the least thing you should do, and the most transformational thing you can do, is align those internal public sector boundaries.
Okay.
And also I think unitarization has to be compulsory. And I think we just need to bite the bullet on that.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. So Joe, thank you very much, has a question about it's looking at travel to work areas as economies, commuting distances. I think this is really about post-COVID. Essentially, how is travel to work going to affect? How's travel to work going to affect this agenda?
Yeah.
I mean, we've covered some of this, but any?
Yeah. So I think places are ever evolving.
Okay.
So I think that's partly why the decision making in this country, whether that's, let's say high speed 2, right. We say by the time we've got around to building it, runway is another example, like the need is 30 years out of date. Yeah. So I think we need to be much more agile in our ability to make effective decisions, particularly when it comes to transport infrastructure and thinking about housing and planning and all of the other stuff that goes into that. I think it also comes into like things that I'm not an expert in, but the built, like design of the built environment.
Yeah.
So you allow places to flex much more than they currently do for uses and or demand that we can't even envisage today.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the answer. But as I said before, I think, and there was an article in the FT today about the 15-minute city. So whether or not, our immediate sense of place will shrink,
yeah,
is maybe one thing. But I commute 2 hours to work, so I'm willing to make that trip. But that's partly also because I live in Wiltshire and we haven't yet done that thing called levelling up and opportunity as much as needs to happen, particularly at the kind of knowledge end of the income and skills distribution. So I think a lot of these things need to be done concurrently.
Yes, no, I would agree. I'm just thinking about, so one thing I was interested in talking to you about was, and I've got my own thoughts on this, was about the Preston model. Mm-hmm. Or any thoughts on that at all in terms of, I mean, I sort of think about it when I think about this agenda, because it's a significant idea from the left, and we haven't had many like that, being brutally honest. And some people love it, some people hate it. And I think there's probably things about it that I think are interesting, and then there's something about it that I sort of don't like. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on the Preston model.
I don't hate it.
Yeah.
And I think it's perfectly compatible with other forms of thinking about local regeneration, local economic development, and city regional devolution, for sure.
Yeah.
I don't think it's enough on its own.
Yeah.
I think we've seen efforts before, like the Bristol Pound or the Brixton Pound, attempt to do this kind of the same thing. So how do you build and retain wealth in a place? And one measure of inclusive growth, your ability to be able to do that. But even though, and a lot of the literature talks about anchor institutions and the role of the public sector particularly, I think that's hugely important.
Yeah.
The social value about procuring and all of that. But I don't think it goes far enough in thinking about how you engage with the private sector and how you mainstream a lot more of those ideas and how you strike a new social contract with business at a local level. So what does it mean to be a local employer in this place?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be kind of with and for our community? And that's why I'm so interested in community businesses and social enterprise, because it's like the ultimate direct form of purpose-driven business for a community. Again, though, I don't think that's the full story. You need this, multifaceted diversity, because ultimately a market system has to prevail. We just have to make that work better for people. So I'd be quite open and honest by saying I think we need growth. I think we need to retain a market system, but we need radical reform to both of those ideas to think about how we allow places to grow fairly and sustainably.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that is, I agree on that.
What are the bits of it that you hate?
Well, I guess I'm instinctively a free trader, so I just don't like the protectionist bit of it. But I think if I was delving into it a bit more complexity, I think the problem is that in a sense, it feels to me like what the Preston model does is it maximizes what you've got, right? Like I can see that bit of it. So you're saying we've got this. Let's try and connect those bits and make those interconnect as much as possible and maximize them as much as possible. So we'll buy your stuff and you'll buy our stuff, but in a sense, you're not. You're sort of just maximizing what you've got, but you're not really growing. That's what I think. That's probably my slightly cynical take on the Preston model. I'm sure people will come to me and say, no, well, they won't do that. But what I worry about, again, coming back to what we were talking about in your foreign direct investment and stuff like that, and like how do we actually get growth in these places? And I just feel like that's not really the answer, because you're actually not really growing. What you're really doing is you're just maximizing what you've already got in those places, which in some cases isn't very much.
Yeah. And the state can do an awful lot, but if the last 10 years are to be, if we learn anything, is that public sector revenues can't always be guaranteed. So
yeah, exactly, precisely.
Protect what money you're getting in, then still limited. Exactly,
I totally agree. I mean, obviously, you come at it at a slightly socialist view and say, well, we'll just give them more money, but you're sort of into a reductive argument there. There's another question that we've got, which is from Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, for this, which is about, it's a very straightforward question, which is it that local government administrators are not viewed as terribly good, which means the center ignores them? So basically, it's a classic one in this debate, which is local government just rubbish? Well, that's why we don't evolve. I mean, in the end, it's kind of I always find in these debates, it's always the classic centralizers last stand, they're great, which is sort of why I came back to structure of government and restructure it. But basically, based on what we've got, how much what's your riposte?
Well, let's just
before you come in, Charlotte, I see that Sheila's also adding to that. Actually, local government's just been hollowed out, so there's nobody left, whether they're good or not. So maybe pick that up too.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't quite saying I think local government are rubbish. I was asking, is there a problem here about how the centre sees local government, and
indeed,
whether it's real or not? And how do you attack those bits of the problem, so you get really good people in local government who are seen to be really good?
Yeah.
I would say that I think we've moved a long way. So when I left central government to go and work on the City Growth Commission, so that was 2014, I would say that it scared me, the leap we had to go on in terms of central government trusting local government to deliver. And I think there are some exceptions, but in Greater Manchester being probably the only one at that time, and the permanent secretary in the Treasury saying, why can't we have more Greater Manchesters, please? But I think we have moved a long way. And I think the likes of Andy Burnham and Andy Street and others, Ben Houchin and others, making the case for strong, effective, as much as possible, mayors for combined authorities. I think that's the start of a shift. I think Boris Johnson being a former mayor, I think that's also part of this story and not to be forgotten. But I also think we have to watch central government, because let's take COVID and the role of local public health directors, for example. Central government can easily say, and we saw this in Leicester, you're rubbish, you're not doing your job, you're not protecting local people, you're not responding quickly enough, you're not getting test and trace, or whatever else you need to be doing, you're not doing it. And local government can rightly turn around and say, well, you're not giving us the levers to do that at all. And in fact, your incompetent central government is making our jobs even harder. So we appear less competent to you, but we're trying our best, given that we're, trying to operate blind here, because you're not giving us the data information or the powers to respond. So I think central government plays a very canny game in that regard. It says, local government, you're rubbish. It then denies them the resource and says, look, local government, you're rubbish. Go figure.
Yeah, I agree. There is that. There's kind of circular argument. You deprive them of funds, then say, look how little they're doing, and you sort of created your own proof, basically, what you wanted. Yeah, so I totally.
And that's not just a resource thing. We see that in the kind of policy delivery. And I mentioned the devolution of adult education budget earlier with skills. So much local authority lap time spent trying to deal with the legislative implications of that process, that on the one hand should be a real next step for devolution, actually just becomes a bureaucratic nightmare. And then central government goes, well, look, you can't even handle the admin.
Yeah, exactly.
What strategic thinking.
Yes. So we've got a question here from the very esteemed Tom Brake, who was at one point the deputy leader of the House of Commons.
Indeed.
Yes, indeed. And he asked if local authorities are going to have to merge post-COVID and what the implications of that might be. Your thoughts?
So I mentioned unitarization. I think some places they should definitely do that, and they should do that for efficiency's sake. And I think actually a public duty around, who's employed to do what and how much they get paid. So, leaders and chief execs of district councils, I think there's some question marks that need to be raised that could be quite challenging for the sector. So some of those mergers, particularly where they're then merging into upper tier, that have that operate at that functional economic geography that we were talking about earlier. I think they should happen, and they're right to happen, and economically and politically it's what should happen.
Right.
But I think there is an interesting point that Tom raises implicitly, which is around identity. So there was a stage where the Treasury tried to kind of create a new region in the Midlands, North Midlands, I think. And people sort of thought, well, what? That doesn't resonate with us. And I think that we have to tread carefully where it comes to identity, because we've talked a lot about the economics today, but there is a democratic dimension to this, a constitutional dimension, which is hugely important. And I think it's not that we can't cope with a shift in how we conceive of our place, but I think that has to be done sensitively and potentially, if not gradually, with a view to engaging the public in that process.
Right. Just while we're here, I've got a question from Gail Clintworth about, if she could come in with her question. She wanted to come in with a question. Gail, if you're there?
Yep. Hi there, Charlotte. Hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. Charlotte, have you thought about these new free ports and economic zones that are being announced, and how we might be able to use those to really leapfrog and catalyze some form of local development? I ask that because I'm working on those sorts of projects in Africa, which I know seems to be a very far place, but in fact, many of the problems are similar. So that's my question.
It's a good question. I think again, I think the economic argument is slightly misaligned with the current political one. And I think that's partly because we haven't addressed the constitutional political questions around what binds us as a United Kingdom, and how then a more variated model, including a free ports, could fit within that, and for us still to have a sense of identity as a nation at a UK level, or even an English level or a British level, or any which way. And so I think when we started talking about some of those ideas, say, would London retain some of the rights of access to European markets throughout the Theresa May Brexit process, I think it started to raise questions around the limits of devolution as we are currently conceiving it. So whilst there may be a very clear economic case, how do we retain that sense of political identity as a whole? So I think let's explore the idea, and I understand the Chancellor's been interested in it in the past, but I think we have to tie it to some other questions that I know Number 10 are exercised by, and that's particularly the union. And I would say, Nick, I'd say we talked about kind of busting some myths at the beginning of this around the myth that is the national economy.
Yeah.
I think the concept of a United Kingdom government is actually probably fast becoming a myth.
I agree. Yeah, I'd agree.
So sorry not to tackle your question head on, Gail, but I just think that the politics of this are so sensitive at the moment that I would probably go there first before looking at the economic benefits of it.
Yeah. Okay, we just, I guess when one's trying to resolve political tensions and national identities or mini national identity. That can take so long that the economic opportunity might not be there in future, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just say on free ports. I mean, I'm for the idea. I don't see, it's great. I just don't think that they're going to be as beneficial as some people think. You sort of go, it's kind of like, you sort of say we have a, so we've got a problem, we've got a seaside problem, why don't we fix it? And free ports is, well, that's great. And I think that would be great for wherever is chosen as the free port. But what happens to, 10 miles? We've got such a problem with the seaside that I just think, how many free ports can we set up, if you like? That's my only thought about free ports is, okay, great. Okay. Yeah, but
No, that's cool. It would be nice to have a separate conversation at some time, because I think
agreed.
At some point.
Agreed. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
No worries. Thank you. Right. Okay. So let's see what we've got here. I want to try and get to as many questions as I possibly can do. So thank you everybody as well for sending them in. So I've got one from Chris, which is he asks about the link between globalism and localism, which is a broad question, but interesting. We could talk about that. And there's one where Gordon has asked about, I think he was referring to your bit about the Greater Manchester and the powers, etc. But that, what about those who are just on the wrong side of the city boundaries, which is a sort of wrinkle on the town's question, I guess. So you've got Greater Manchester and that's covered, and as you say, Burnham has to cover that, and that's great. But what if you're just the other side of, you're the street over from the end of Greater Manchester? Anyway, so those are two things. So I think we've got about 8 or 9 minutes. We got about 6 or 7 minutes actually now, but we can.
Okay. So on the GM question, I think we're seeing a real shift in that. So if you had asked the former chief exec of Manchester, Howard Bernstein, what about Lancashire?
Yeah.
He would say, I don't care.
Yeah.
Say that. Now, particularly with the kind of Northern Powerhouse brand and potential being revisited again at the moment, I think the question around what of Lancashire, what role of Cumbria in the Northern Powerhouse, and a more nuanced view of economic geography and the relationship between different places, whether that's towns and city regions, whether that's city regions and neighbouring counties, whether that's between city regions, Great Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Hull, whatever. I think there's more of a nuance, and I think that can only help when it comes to thinking around how places actually function, how their local economies interact, and what we need to do to allow them to grow and collaborate rather than necessarily kind of compete for capital, resource, or people, or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would say that. What was the other question that you wanted me to think about?
So there was one about globalism and localism. If there's anything else that you want to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think also I've seen Barry's Cooper's question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I think we'll take that.
Versus top down.
Yeah.
I think that sort of feeds in as well, because I think so I've spoken today in quite a sort of, a bird's eye view of how you think about the map.
Yeah.
But actually, the whole premise of devolution is that you have to level up from the ground up. It's a requirement of how you understand place. It's addressing an information failure problem, to go all economics-y. Central government doesn't know what community A, B, or C needs to really allow its economy to thrive. Those places need to be driving that. And so we don't, as I said earlier, let's not replicate the failures of our centralized political economy at a more city, regional, or even lower level. So that's what I would say on that point. And then on the global question, local versus global, there's all sorts of writers talking down the role of the nation state. I think, again, the death of the nation state is also exaggerated as much as any other kind of conception of unit geography. Continue to play a part. And as I said previously, we need to have an integrated structure of governance and economic development and economic thinking that allows you to flex in and out across all of those various levels. But I think we have to think about global capital flows, and coming back to your FDI question, we've got to think about how we can create, whether it's funds or other financial instruments that allow for impact investing in places, whether that's Burnley or Bradford or, you know, anywhere else. So I'd say we need to harness a greater propensity for impact investing. We need to harness this sense of mission or purpose-driven business that we're seeing, and we need to hold businesses, particularly large businesses, to account for making sure that they do what they say they want to do, so that that isn't just kind of, you know, social justice washing and saying, don't worry, we'll do something nice. We are building, you know, good jobs, good employment, and making sure that that FDI is really constructive, productive investment in a place, not just rebadging companies at the gates and stripping out jobs and the rest, like we have seen with the Kraft takeover and others. Yeah,
agreed. I mean, just on Barry's point about top down versus bottom up, I'd only say that it's actually it's a tendency we all fall into, and it's understandable because power is so centralized in the United Kingdom. So it can be very difficult to actually think bottom up, because we've started at such a centralized point that it's obvious to think about, well, because we want to talk about power and taking it down, it can often be difficult to go, well, hold on, wait a second, let's try and look at this from the bottom up. So it's a fair point, but that is sort of why we end up with it. It's sort of a consequence of being so overly centralized, I think. That's my point, take on it. So I'm going to hand this back to Ben soon. Is there any last thoughts on anything, Charlotte? Anything we haven't covered, anything we haven't said that you...
The only thing I would say is that I don't think local government always gets it right. You know, sometimes we make the mistake, particularly given what you just said, Nick, of saying, well, if we devolve to local places, that means we put power in the hands of local government, and it becomes a municipal version of economic devolution, rather than one that is really empowering and doing right by communities. And I think that's something that we have to remember all the time in this whole discussion.
Agreed. Well, thank you very much, Charlotte. I shall hand it back to you, Ben.
And can I just say thank you to Nick and to Charlotte for a really fascinating discussion. Actually, I'm conscious we didn't get through all of the questions. I don't think we have yet in one of these webinars, and that's just as well, because it means that there's an ongoing discussion to have. Some interesting comments from Jay Sharma on new localism that we didn't get to. And Charlotte, I don't know if you want to take a chance at the end of this to look at some of the chat comments and see if there's anything you particularly want to come back to. So this, as I say, is our final one in our session looking at constitutional issues. But our aim is to take this forward, and over the summer I'm going to be doing some thinking about how we pick up the issues of localism, of local economics, of the impact of COVID on local media, and the State of the Union that we've been looking at over the last month and a half. And if people would like to be involved in that discussion, have thoughts, please do drop me an email via the Radix website. Lots of things coming up. We should be taking a bit of a break for the summer, but actually not much. For those that may have seen in The Guardian over the weekend, we launched our health paper with an interesting comment piece calling for more decentralisation by Andrew Lansley. That paper you can now see on our website at radixuk.org. Please do look it up, and we have further papers coming on China and education and all resilience. That second one particularly interesting because it comes from Politica, which is our youth organisation. Whilst we're taking a break as Radix UK, the Radix Centre for Business and Politics, which particularly focuses on the role of business in addressing economic, social and political issues, is hosting on the 30th of July a discussion with John Kay and Lord King, the former governor of the Bank of England, moderated by Vicky Price, looking at their new book called Radical Uncertainty. Again, the details are on our website, and I think that's definitely one not to miss. Very lastly, to say Radix is a not-for-profit charity, as I guess all charities are, but we're not for profit. We are supported by individuals, and if you have enjoyed either this webinar or indeed any of our series, please do think about how you could support us. Either we've been recommending £10 for taking part in one of our webinars, or 25 for the series, or if you feel you can go further than that as well, consider becoming a patron, and the details again on our website. You can donate through the button on our website. One final thank you to Nick and Charlotte for an excellent discussion, and we can look forward to continuing it over the next few months. Thank you very much, and good night to everybody.